You should thank me for cleaning up the house. That pile of papers was dusty and just taking up space. I sold them for $300, just enough to buy 2 VIP tickets to see Taylor Swift. You wouldn't want to go anyway since you don't like modern music, but Kayla and I really need that experience. I did what was best for this house. Diane said it while standing in the kitchen, still tapping on her phone, her voice carrying that easy confidence of someone who had just made a decision, inconvenient for someone else, and believed it was the right thing. I stood in the doorway of the storage room, the small room at the end of the hallway in the house on Spruce Street, where I had lived for 23 years. The room that held an old green metal filing cabinet with 4 drawers, each with its own lock. And I had bought that cabinet at an office liquidation sale in 2008 and had used it to store my collection for 15 years. 4 drawers, all wide open, all empty. My name is Adele Ann Sullivan. I am 68 years old. For 29 years as an archivist at the Free Library of Philadelphia, I spent every working day with historical documents, understanding that the value of handwriting lies not in the ink and paper, but in the moment when that ink was placed on that paper with intention. And for 37 years, I built a collection of stamps and handwritten letters, not to show off or to invest, but to preserve moments when someone chose to write something down and believed their words mattered enough to be sent. $300 for Taylor Swift tickets. All right, I said. Diane looked up, and slightly surprised by the brevity of my response. You're not angry? No, I said. I stepped into the storage room, opening each drawer out of habit, even though I knew they were empty. Then I asked, which shop did you sell them to? Antique Attic on South Street. The owner, some older guy. He paid cash right away. All right, I said. I closed the storage room door and walked into my bedroom. Are you okay? Diane called after me, her voice now carrying a trace of uncertainty. I'm fine, I said, closing the door. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked out the window. March in Philadelphia. The trees along Spruce Street were still bare, the sky a pale gray of late winter. I sat in silence for about 15 minutes, not because I was numb, but because I was organizing what needed to be organized before beginning what needed to be done. There was something Diane, my 41-year-old daughter, a marketing employee at a small advertising firm in Center City, Philadelphia, had never known about the collection. Not everything in those 4 metal drawers was just dusty paper. I knew that because I was an archivist. I had spent 29 years learning how to read the value of documents not from appearance, but from content, context, and provenance. I had examined thousands of old letters at the Free Library, cataloging and classifying materials that most people would look at and see only yellowed paper and faded ink. In my collection were many items worth anywhere from a few dollars to a few hundred. But there was one piece I had not examined closely in years, something even I was not entirely certain about. A handwritten letter in black ink, placed in a thin, pale yellow envelope, which I had found tucked inside an old book purchased at a flea market in Germantown in 1998. The handwriting on the outside bore no recipient's name, only a short signature in the lower right corner, a signature I had seen but not studied carefully at the time, because my collection was still small and I lacked the experience to recognize its significance. 25 years later, That letter was now sitting in the antique attic shop on South Street, along with the rest of the collection I had spent 37 years building. And I needed to get there before someone else recognized its value before I did. Before continuing, I want to speak about those 29 years as an archivist, because what happened cannot be understood without understanding what those years built within me. I began working at the Free Library of Philadelphia in 1988 at 29 years old, with a master's degree in library and information science from Drexel University. My first job, processing archivist in the Special Collections Department, where the library preserves some of the most important historical materials of Philadelphia and Pennsylvania. The Special Collections Department is one of the least known treasures in Philadelphia. It holds letters, diaries, and manuscripts from people who shaped the history of this city and of the United States, from the founding fathers to poets, scientists, art and social activists of the 19th and 20th centuries. My job was to classify, catalog, preserve, and assist scholars in accessing those materials. It was not glamorous work. No one knows the archivist's name. There are no public events, no speeches. But it was work I believed mattered in the deepest way. Without it, those stories would disappear. Over 29 years, I handled tens of thousands of documents. From that work, I learned how to recognize value from just a few signs: the type of paper, the ink, the handwriting style, the language and expressions typical of each era, the postmarks, the envelopes. I also learned something no school teaches. Most historically significant value does not come from things people recognize as important right away. It comes from things overlooked until enough time has passed, and the context becomes clear. My collection of stamps and handwritten letters began in 1986, 2 years before I joined the Free Library, when Robert Sullivan, the man I married at 24, and I visited an antique market in Bucks County on a Sunday. Robert was a civil engineer, not much overlap with my library work, but we shared one thing: a curiosity about things that existed before us and would continue to exist after their creators were gone. He loved old wood furniture. I loved old paper. For many years, we went to antique markets every Sunday, not necessarily to buy anything, but to look, and to be reminded that the world had existed long before us and would continue long after. The collection was something we built together over 20 years, not by both of us choosing every single piece of paper, but by creating together the habit of searching for and preserving moments from the past. In 2008, Robert and I divorced after 32 years of marriage, not because the love ended in any dramatic way, but because we had become two different people in a way that no longer made living together better for either of us. It was the kind of divorce people call civilized. No legal battles, no accusations, no children being pulled in different directions. Robert took the antique furniture. I kept the paper and stamp collection, not because I wanted to win in the division of assets, but because that collection was a memory that could not be divided. It did not belong to me or to Robert, but to the Sunday spent searching, the evening spent sorting, and the feeling of finding something that carried history within it. Diane knew this, and she had grown up watching Robert and me go to antique markets every Sunday. She knew the collection was the one thing I kept from that marriage, and she still sold it to buy concert tickets. Did they really think I had become so senile that I wouldn't understand what had happened? I want to say more about the Special Collections Department of the Free Library, because that is where I learned the most important lessons about the value of historical documents. I also want to speak about the house on Spruce Street, because it is an essential setting in this story, not as a neutral backdrop, but as something tied to decisions and memories in the way only houses that have lived long enough can be. The house at 2247 Spruce Street is a 3-story brick row house, built in 1895, the kind Philadelphia has by the thousands, lined up along straight streets with similar windows and doors, yet each one still carrying something distinct after centuries of being lived in by different people. On Sunday, March 12th, at 9 a.m, I arrived at the antique attic on South Street. South Street in Philadelphia is a street people know in the truest sense of the word, not as a tourist attraction, but as part of the city's living rhythm. Antique shops, restaurants, small art galleries, used bookstores, 19th century brick buildings still intact, alongside newer storefronts. Antique Attic is one of the longest-running shops, operating since 1972. I had been to this shop many times over the years and knew Gerald Hoffman, the owner, 75 years old, a man with a white mustache and thick glasses like the bottom of a bottle. He knew I worked at the library, and sometimes we would talk about stamps and old papers. When I walked in, the shop was unusually crowded for a Sunday morning. I understood why the moment I looked toward the front counter. 2 men were standing beside Gerald Hoffman, and all 3 were leaning over something on the counter. I moved close enough to hear without drawing attention. "The paper matches the period," one man said, his voice scholarly, careful. "The ink looks appropriately aged, and the signature." "I recognize that signature," the other man said, his voice low and measured, the voice of someone who had seen many things and was not easily impressed. "The question is why it's here in the collection of a woman when she—" "Who is she?" Gerald Hoffman asked. "Her daughter sold it yesterday, said it was her mother's things, needed to clear out." I knew exactly what they were talking about. I had known since the night before, sitting alone in my bedroom, recalling every item in the 4 drawers, and thinking about the letter in the pale yellow envelope I had found in 1998. I did not interrupt the conversation. I circled toward the back of the shop like a regular customer, pretending to browse boxes of stamps and old envelopes on the shelves, watching from a safe distance. "How much?" the low-voiced man asked. Gerald Hoffman paused. "I need to authenticate it before setting a price. I can put down a deposit today to hold it. $50,000 as a deposit." $50,000 as a deposit for something Diane had sold for a total of $300, along with the entire collection. I set the box of stamps back on the shelf and turned toward the exit. On Monday morning, before doing anything else, I called Margaret Holloway. Margaret Holloway, a 55-year-old civil attorney with an office on Walnut Street, was someone I had known from my time at the Free Library. She had come to the library to research historical documents for several inheritance-related cases. We were not close in the sense of friendship, but we trusted each other enough for me to know she would go straight to the point. "Margaret," I said when she answered, "I need help. My daughter sold my antique collection without permission. I need to know whether that transaction is legally valid." "When can you come in?" Margaret asked immediately, without wasting time on reassurance. "Is 3 this afternoon okay?" "That works." At 3:00, I sat in Margaret's compact office and explained everything. She listened and took notes. When I finished, she asked 2 questions. "Is the collection under your name in any documentation?" "Entirely in my name. I have receipts for each item over the years. I kept them carefully, out of archival habit." "Did your daughter sign any sales contract or receive the money through her personal account?" "I don't know about a contract. The money, according to Diane, was paid in cash at the shop." Margaret nodded. "Under Pennsylvania law, a person does not have the legal right to sell someone else's property, even if they are a family member. If the transaction was done in cash without a sales contract signed by the legal owner, it is not legally complete and can be contested." "So I can get it back?" "If the shop has not resold it to a third party, you have a strong legal basis to reclaim it, especially if you have proof of ownership, receipts, documentation." "I have an entire box." "Good," Margaret said, her tone shifting to that of someone beginning work. "Tomorrow we go to that shop. On Tuesday, March 14th. At 10 in the morning, Margaret and I arrived at Antique Attic. Gerald Hoffman recognized me the moment I walked in. On his face was a mix of recognition and concern, the kind antique dealers develop when they sense a transaction is becoming more complicated than expected. "Miss Sullivan," he said. "Mr. Hoffman," I replied. "This is Margaret Holloway, my attorney. We're here regarding the collection my daughter brought in on Saturday." Gerald Hoffman looked at Margaret, then back at me. "I was worried this might happen," he said honestly. She seemed very young to own a collection like that, and when I asked about its provenance, her answers weren't convincing. "You haven't resold anything yet, have you?" Margaret asked directly. "No," Gerald said. 2 men came asking about some items from the lot, especially the letter in the yellow envelope, but I refused a deposit because I wanted to authenticate it first. I let out a quiet breath. Margaret presented the documents, copies of several purchase receipts I had brought. Not complete, since most were still at home, but enough to establish a pattern of ownership. She explained the legal basis. Gerald Hoffman listened without interrupting. "I understand the situation," he said when she finished. "To be honest, I had concerns from the moment I accepted the lot. Your daughter, she didn't know anything about the collection when I asked. She couldn't name a single author, didn't know the dates, didn't know the origins." "The $300 you paid her," I said, "can be recovered from my daughter." "I'm not worried about the money," Gerald said. He stood up. "Come with me." He led us into the back storage room, a large space with metal shelves and locked cabinets where he kept items not yet priced or awaiting authentication. My collection was laid out on a wide work table, boxes of stamps, old envelopes, letters wrapped in acid-free paper that I had prepared myself years ago when I was still at the library. And in the center, inside a protective plastic sleeve, was the letter in the pale yellow envelope. I placed my hand on the table and looked at my collection. 37 years. Sundays spent searching. Robert standing beside me before we went our separate ways. "I need to examine that letter," I said to Gerald. "Of course," he replied, and he opened the protective sleeve and removed the letter, placing it on a special surface designed for historical documents. I put on the cotton gloves I had brought, a habit from 29 years that never left, and picked up the letter. Now, with 29 years of knowledge and eyes no longer clouded by the distractions of life, I read the signature at the bottom clearly. I stood still for about 10 seconds. "Mr. Hoffman," I said, my voice calmer than I felt, "this letter needs to be taken to an authentication specialist at the Philadelphia History Museum today, if possible." Gerald Hoffman looked at me. "You know what this is?" "I believe I do," I said. "And if I'm right, this is not something any antique shop should keep without proper preservation." The next 3 days were spent in a level of focus I had only known during my years at the Free Library. Dr. James Okafor, the 58-year-old Nigerian-American Director of Collections at the Philadelphia History Museum, a man I had worked with on several projects during my library years, agreed to examine the letter that very Wednesday afternoon. "Adele," he said after about 20 minutes of examination with a magnifying glass, UV light, and reference materials, "I need to send samples for carbon analysis and ink composition testing before making an official confirmation. But based on what I see—" He paused, looking at the letter again. "Now, you may have acquired something very special back in 1998 without ever fully realizing it." "Special in what way?" "The signature, based on handwriting style and sentence structure, makes it quite clear to me who the writer is, but I need scientific confirmation before I say more." "I understand," I said. "I worked in archives for 29 years. I know the process." "Of course," James Okafor said, and there was something in his voice I was not used to hearing directed at me, the respect of one professional for another. The scientific analysis took 48 hours. On Friday afternoon, James Okafor called me. "Adele, the analysis confirms the paper and ink are consistent with the period between 1860 and 1865, and the signature, after comparison with the Library of Congress database," he paused, "is that of Abraham Lincoln." I sat still at my kitchen table for about a minute. "The content of the letter?" I asked. "A personal letter related to a land dispute in Pennsylvania in 1862. Not a major political document, but a personal letter from Lincoln, something that, in this condition with a confirmed signature, carries very high collector value." "How much?" I asked, not because I intended to sell, but because I needed to fully understand what was happening. Personal letters from Lincoln have been auctioned anywhere between $200,000 and $800,000, depending on content and condition. This one, its condition is remarkably good. I would estimate initially around $300,000 to $400,000. And in the collection my daughter had sold for $300 to buy Taylor Swift tickets. On Monday, March 20th, I sat in a small meeting room at the Philadelphia History Museum with James Okafor and 2 strangers, Dr. Patricia Webb from the Smithsonian Institution Archives and Marcus Johnson from the Manuscripts and Archives Division of the Library of Congress. The meeting began with Dr. Webb and Marcus Johnson examining the letter and the full authentication record. What followed was a technical discussion that I both listened to and participated in where my archival knowledge applied. Toward the end, Dr. Webb turned to me. "Miss Sullivan, the Smithsonian is interested in this letter and potentially in the entire collection if there are other significant materials. Could you describe the collection as a whole? I described each category: 19th century stamps and envelopes. There's correspondence from different historical periods in Pennsylvania and Philadelphia, some Civil War era documents. Not everything was highly valuable individually, but taken as a whole. As a whole, Marcus Johnson said after listening, this is a collection assembled by someone with professional archival knowledge, not a random accumulation. I worked as an archivist at the Free Library for 29 years, I confirmed. Dr. Webb looked at me in a way few people had in recent years, with the recognition of someone seeing something of value. Ms. Sullivan, we would like to offer you several options. The Free Library of Philadelphia, established in 1894 through the bequests of William Pepper and Dr. William Furness, is one of the largest and most important public libraries in the northeastern United States. In its main building on Benjamin Franklin Parkway, completed in 1927, is among the most beautiful architectural landmarks in Philadelphia. Domed ceilings, marble columns, and tall windows overlooking the city's widest avenue. The Special Collections Department is located on the 3rd floor, behind wooden doors that close automatically. Inside, temperature and humidity are carefully controlled to archival standards. Lighting is adjusted to protect old paper and ink, and every drawer and cabinet is labeled and continuously updated within a classification system. I sat on my bed for about an hour and did nothing in the physical sense. But my mind did not stop. It was working the way archivists work, organizing information in sequence, identifying what is known and what is not, and structuring the next steps. Robert and I bought this house in 1998. The same year I found the letter in the pale yellow envelope, though I did not understand its significance until much later. We chose it because it was within walking distance of the Free Library, and because it had a small second-floor room overlooking the backyard, a room I turned into a reading space, and later into the place where the green filing cabinet held my collection. My meeting with James Okafor at the Philadelphia History Museum brought me something unexpected, not only confirmation about the letter, but also a realization about myself. What was known: the collection had been sold. Diane sold it. The shop was Antique Attic on South Street. Cash, $300. No signed contract. Phase 5, Freedom and Awakening. Part 10, April, the agreement with the Smithsonian. In April 2023, after weeks of negotiation, I signed an agreement to donate the collection to the Smithsonian Institution. Not sell, donate, under conditions carefully negotiated by Margaret Holloway over those weeks. The first condition: the entire collection would be preserved as a unified body under the name the Adele Sullivan Collection, not separated or divided. And the second condition: the collection would be exhibited in a dedicated gallery at the National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C., with a plaque describing its provenance and my archival work at the Free Library of Philadelphia. The third condition, negotiated by Margaret based on precedent from similar cultural donations: the Smithsonian would provide me with a cultural preservation stipend of $4,200 per month for life, in recognition of my contribution to preserving historical heritage. The fourth condition: I would receive the title of Honorary Cultural Preservation Donor from the Smithsonian, along with an invitation to serve on the advisory board for its private collections program. "You're sure you don't want to sell the Lincoln letter separately?" Margaret asked me before I signed. "You could get $300,000 to $400,000 immediately." "No," I said. "That letter belongs to the collection. I don't want to separate it." Margaret studied me for a moment. "You understand that purely financially, donating the entire collection and receiving $4,200 a month will take many years to equal the value of the Lincoln letter if sold outright?" "I understand," I said, "but the collection is not something I built to sell. I built it to preserve, and if I must let it go, I want it to go where it belongs most." Margaret nodded. "All right. Sign." In May, after the agreement with the Smithsonian was finalized, and before I moved, I met Diane once. Not because she asked, she didn't yet know the details of what had happened. I hadn't told her about the Lincoln letter, the Smithsonian, or the stipend. Not out of secrecy, but because the time to say it had not yet come. I invited Diane to a cafe near the house, a neutral place, neither mine nor hers. She arrived with the expression of someone prepared with a small apology and a long explanation. I let her speak first. "Mom, I know you're upset. I'm sorry about the collection. I didn't think it through. I won't do it again. But honestly, you have to admit it was just taking up space and—" "Diane," I said, "yes, I'm not angry, and I'm not here to hear your apology or your explanation. I'm here to tell you a few things, and then I will leave." Diane fell silent. "That collection has been donated to the Smithsonian Institution. The letter the antique dealer had 2 buyers offering a $50,000 deposit for is a personal letter written by Abraham Lincoln. Its value is approximately $300,000 to $400,000. The collection as a whole has been recognized by the Smithsonian as a cultural asset of national significance." Diane's face changed gradually as I spoke. When I finished, she said nothing for about 30 seconds. "Mom, I'm not finished," I said calmly. "I receive a stipend of $4,200 per month for life from the Smithsonian in recognition of cultural preservation. I will be moving to a new apartment in Rittenhouse Square in June. And then I will not contact you again unless and until you are ready for a relationship based on respect rather than convenience." "You can't." "I can," I said, "and I have decided." I stood up. "The tea is good, Diane. Thank you for coming." I placed money on the table for both cups, put on my coat, and left. In June 2023, I moved into an apartment on Locust Street overlooking Rittenhouse Square, the most beautiful park square in central Philadelphia. A 1-bedroom apartment on the 7th floor with large windows. Not luxurious in the way magazines define luxury, but it was mine, with good light and enough space for the things I truly wanted. A reading chair, bookshelves, a small table by the window for morning tea while looking out over the square. I furnished the apartment with things that mattered, not to prove anything, but because at 68, I no longer had time to live with things that held no meaning. On the living room wall, I hung a large photograph, the display plaque for the Adele Sullivan collection at the National Museum of American History, Smithsonian, Washington, D.C., not because I needed the reminder, but because it was something I wanted to see every morning. I am writing these lines on an October morning, sitting at the small table by the window, looking out over Rittenhouse Square. October in Philadelphia is turning, chestnut and oak trees in the square shifting into reds and golds in the way Philadelphia autumns do, slowly, clearly, without display. Diane called me once in August. I did not answer. She left a message, not an apology, but a question about the money I had received. I did not respond. I did not do that out of anger. I did it because I have learned from 29 years of working with historical documents, from letters written by people who lived and loved and lost and left memories behind, that not every relationship can be repaired, and not every repair means returning to what once was. Sometimes a relationship needs a clear boundary so that both sides can become better people, one side becoming freer, the other given the chance to learn what must be learned without being protected from the consequences of their own choices. Looking back on this story, there are things I want to say, not as lessons, but as truths about the collection and its value. The Adele Sullivan collection is now on display at the Smithsonian. The Lincoln letter is placed in a specialized glass case under controlled lighting for preservation. I went to see it for the first time in July, standing before the case and looking at the letter I had found in an old book in Germantown in 1998, without fully understanding its meaning for 25 years. What I felt was not pride in the sense of victory. It was something lighter and deeper, the quiet satisfaction of someone who has done the right thing with what they were entrusted to keep, about letters and memory. In 29 years as an archivist, I handled tens of thousands of handwritten documents. Not all were historically significant, but all were important in the most fundamental way. Someone sat down, put pen to paper, and wrote what they wanted to say to another person. That act, whether the writer was a president or an ordinary person, whether the letter was sent to a lover or a lawyer, is an act of belief that what one has to say is worth writing down and preserving. The value of time is not in money. It lies in memory, in what we choose to keep, what we choose to protect, and what we choose to leave behind after we are gone. Diane chose $300 and 2 concert tickets. I chose what I chose, and now each of us is living with that choice. I am 68 years old. I sit at the table by the window overlooking Rittenhouse Square, drinking tea and watching the leaves change. There is a book open on the table, A History of Presidential Correspondence in 19th Century America, a gift from Dr. Patricia Webb of the Smithsonian, sent with a letter of thanks. Good morning. And that is enough. When Robert and I divorced in 2008, he moved out and I stayed. Not because I was awarded the house in the settlement. We sold it, and I bought out his share. I bought it because I could not imagine that reading room and that green filing cabinet belonging to someone else. Diane moved back in with me in 2015, after her divorce from her first husband, and before she was financially stable enough to rent her own apartment. Temporary lasted 8 years. James Okafor and I had known each other professionally for many years. He had come to the library to research materials for several museum projects, and we had worked together on a few small preservation initiatives. But in those meetings, I was always the librarian, the one who assisted, who provided materials, not the one who brought something of significance of my own. And this time was different. This time, I was the one bringing something he needed to authenticate, and the way he treated me in that meeting with the respect of one professional to another, was something I had never experienced in quite that way before. What was unknown? Had the shop already resold anything? Was the letter in the pale yellow envelope still there? Was Diane's transaction legally valid? Over those 8 years, the house gradually shifted to reflect Diane more than me, not in the sense of someone taking over another person's home, but in the quiet way such changes happen, my belongings slowly receding into the rooms I used most, hers occupying the rest. The living room became, in practice, Diane's living room, even though the house remained in my name. And the storage room with the green filing cabinet was the only exception. That room Diane never touched until March 11th, 2023. I have mentioned the letter in the pale yellow envelope many times, but I have not told its full story. From the moment I found it to the moment I stood in Gerald Hoffman's storage room, holding it with cotton gloves and fully understanding what I had in my hands, in 1998 at a garage sale in Germantown. I went alone because Robert was busy that day. The seller was a man in his 60s, selling items from his recently deceased father, boxes of books, miscellaneous items from the 1960s, small things of little apparent value. I bought a box of books for $5, about 20 volumes published in the 1940s and 1950s, the kind of popular literature common in that era. When I got home and began unpacking them, the letter slipped out from between two books, Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier and East of Eden by Steinbeck. I looked at the envelope, pale yellow, thick paper, characteristic of the 19th century. No mailing address, only a handwritten name on the front that I did not read carefully because it was faint and small. In the lower right corner was a short signature. I read that signature for about 3 seconds, did not recognize it, and placed the letter into an acid-free plastic sleeve I always carried when browsing for antiques, a habit from my work at the Free Library. I put it into a storage box labeled unclassified and moved on with other things. Unclassified in my collection did not mean unimportant. It meant not yet ready for full examination. I did that with many items, purchasing based on instinct that something mattered, preserving it properly, and waiting until I had the time and focus to truly study it. That time and focus did not come for the next 25 years. Marriage, work, children, divorce, retirement, Diane moving back in. Life creates different priorities at different stages, and the letter in the pale yellow envelope remained in the green filing cabinet, waiting. When Gerald Hoffman took the letter out in his storage room and placed it on the archival surface, I put on my cotton gloves and picked it up. 25 years of knowledge and experience I had accumulated since first seeing that letter poured into the 30 seconds I spent reading it. Handwriting style, characteristic of educated 19th century Northern elites, concise, practical. Paper, consistent with high-quality stationery from the 1860s. Ink, the brown-black tone of iron gall ink properly aged. Content, a specific land dispute in Pennsylvania, and with names and locations consistent with the period. And the signature, short, confident, written in the abbreviated form I had seen in dozens of authenticated documents at the library. 25 years ago, I read that signature and did not recognize it because I did not yet have the experience to do so. Now, standing in the storage room of an antique shop in Philadelphia, I recognized it immediately. 29 years in archival work taught me many things about knowledge, but the most important lesson was not about knowledge. It was about time. People often think archiving is about preserving the past. In reality, it is about preparing for the future, preparing for moments when the materials being preserved will be needed in ways the archivist cannot fully predict. A scholar in 1990 studying 19th century Pennsylvania history needed different documents than a scholar in 2023 studying the same subject, not because history changed, but because the questions people ask change, and the documents that answer those questions may be ones previously overlooked. The Lincoln letter in 1998 was no less valuable than it was in 2023. Its value did not change. What changed was the ability of the observer to recognize it. That applies to everything of value. People are not always ready to see the worth of what is in front of them, and that is not failure. It is simply the reality that human beings need time and experience to fully understand what life places before them. For 25 years, I kept that letter without fully knowing what it was. What mattered was that I kept it properly, according to archival standards I learned at the Free Library during that waiting period, not because I knew it was a letter from Lincoln, but because I knew that anything written and left behind by a human hand deserves to be preserved with care. After Margaret and I retrieved the collection from Antique Attic on Tuesday morning, I returned home that afternoon and found Diane in the kitchen. She was cooking in the way of someone unaware that anything significant had happened that day. I stood in the doorway for a moment before speaking. "Diane," I said, "I've recovered the collection from the antique shop." She turned, surprised. "Why would you do that? It was already sold." "That transaction was not legally valid," I said, my voice steady in the way I had learned over years of handling things that required calm to avoid damage. "You are not the owner of that collection. You had no right to sell it." "Mom, it was just a pile of old papers." "What you just said," I interrupted, still calm, "is something I've heard you say many times about many things, and each time I chose not to argue because I believed you would learn through experience." I met her eyes. "This time, I will be clear. Not all value is immediately measurable. Not everything you don't understand is meaningless." "Are you blaming me for cleaning the house?" "I am talking to you about boundaries," I said. "There are things that are not yours to decide. In this house, that includes my collection." I said nothing more. I left the kitchen and went upstairs to the storage room, where the collection had been returned to the green filing cabinet. For the first time in months, perhaps years, I sat in that room and simply stayed there, with the cabinet closed and locked, with the drawers full again, doing nothing, just being there. The apartment on Locust Street did not come by accident. I had been looking at apartments in the Rittenhouse Square area for months, not because I knew what was about to happen, but because I had already been thinking about change. The house on Spruce Street had been mine for 25 years, but during the 8 years Diane lived there, it gradually became something in between my home and hers, without fully belonging to either of us. That was not entirely Diane's fault. I had allowed it because I wanted to avoid conflict. After resolving the collection situation and beginning negotiations with the Smithsonian, I realized that what I wanted was not to take back the house on Spruce Street from Diane. She would eventually move out in the natural course of things. What I wanted was a new place, one that was entirely mine, and without overlapping histories tied to relationships that no longer served me well. The 7th floor apartment on Locust Street, overlooking Rittenhouse Square, was that place. On my first day moving in, the first Saturday of June, I opened all the windows and sat among unopened boxes, drinking coffee and looking out at the square. There was nothing I needed to do in that moment. Just to be there and recognize that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. It was a feeling I had not realized I had been missing for so long. In July 2023, I traveled to Washington, D.C. for the first time in many years to see the collection displayed at the National Museum of American History. I went alone, no invitations, no announcements. I bought an Amtrak ticket from 30th Street Station in Philadelphia to Washington Union Station, watched the landscape pass from Delaware into Maryland and into the Capitol, and thought about the strange journey of the things waiting for me there. The exhibition space was not large. The Adele Sullivan collection occupied a modest corner of the 19th century historical documents gallery. But it was spacious enough, bright enough, and thoughtfully designed so that anyone standing before it could feel the weight of what was displayed. The Lincoln letter was placed in its own glass case, under controlled lighting. Beside it was a description of the letter and its context. A land dispute in Pennsylvania in 1862, during the first year of the Civil War, when Lincoln carried the burden of a nation at war. And next to that case, on the main display panel for the collection, was a paragraph written by Dr. Webb and James Okafor. This collection was assembled by Ms. Adele Ann Sullivan, who served as an archivist at the Free Library of Philadelphia for 29 years. Over 37 years of collecting, Miss Sullivan applied professional preservation standards to her personal collection, safeguarding historical materials in a manner rarely achieved in private archives. I stood in front of that panel for about 5 minutes, not because I needed to read it again. I already knew its contents, but because standing there, then in a major museum in the center of Washington, D.C., among people from all over the world passing by, and seeing my name on that display, not associated with something done wrong or something done to me, but with something I had done right over 37 years, I needed time to let that settle. A child standing beside me asked his mother, "Mom, who is that?" pointing at my small portrait on the display. "She's the person who kept these things safe for many years," the mother said. The child nodded and looked at the Lincoln letter with the quiet attention of someone seeing something meaningful. I turned and walked out of the museum through the main entrance into the July sunlight of Washington, D.C., and stood on the steps overlooking the National Mall, the long green stretch from the Capitol to the Lincoln Memorial, and with the Washington Monument rising at its center. The person who kept these things safe for many years. That was all I needed to hear. There is something I have not mentioned. Robert Sullivan, my former husband, called me in August 2023. We had stayed loosely in contact over 15 years since the divorce. Not frequently, but enough to know that we were both still living and doing well. He remarried in 2012, lives in Bucks County, and still does some engineering work despite being officially retired. He had heard about the collection and the Smithsonian through Diane. She had called him to tell the story in the way children often turn to one parent when they feel wronged by the other. "Adele," Robert said when I answered, "I heard from Diane. I wanted to call and say one thing." "Go ahead," I said. "That collection was yours. I was lucky to be there for some of the searching, but it was yours from beginning to end, the way you knew how to see and preserve things. And that was yours, not mine. I'm glad it ended up where it belongs." There was a brief silence. "Thank you, Robert," I said. "Does Diane understand?" he asked. "Not yet," I said. "But that's her work to do, not mine." "That's right," Robert said. Then, "Are you okay?" "I am," I said. "Truly." It was a short conversation, and enough. Robert and I had become different people, enough that we could no longer live well together, but still people who knew each other well enough to say what needed to be said. Next step: go to the shop early Sunday morning before opening. Speak with Gerald Hoffman and assess the situation before taking further action. There is something particular about how longtime archivists handle a crisis. We do not begin with emotion. We begin with documentation. What can be confirmed? What cannot? What must be gathered? Emotion comes later, once we know enough to define the problem clearly. That does not mean it does not hurt. It simply means the pain does not obscure what must be done. At 11 that night, I pulled out the old storage box from under my bed, the one containing purchase receipts and documentation related to the collection, and began sorting out the most important items to bring to the shop and to the attorney. That work took about an hour. By midnight, I had a small, organized set of documents ready for the next morning. Then I turned off the lights, lay down, and, to my surprise, fell asleep. Not deeply, not peacefully in the usual sense, but enough, because I had done what could be done that night, and the next morning had a clear purpose. I want to talk about a few specific items in the collection, not to prove their monetary value, but because the story behind each one is part of why the collection matters to me, in a way that can't be expressed in dollars alone. The Pennsylvania postage stamp set from the 1850s to the 1870s, 17 intact stamps in their original envelopes. I bought this set from a vendor at the Peddler's Village Antique Market in 2002 for $75. The seller was an elderly woman who was selling items from her recently deceased mother. Those stamps had belonged to her mother, who had collected them in the 1940s. 3 generations of women before they reached me. The Cooper family correspondence from Philadelphia, written to each other during the Civil War. 9 family letters from Philadelphia, written to a son serving in the Pennsylvania military. I found these letters scattered across 3 separate purchases at 3 different antique markets, and only realized they came from the same family after carefully reading the contents. It took 2 years to assemble all 9. No one in the Cooper family's descendants is alive or aware that these letters exist. And the letter in the pale yellow envelope, which I now know is a letter from Lincoln. But even before I knew that, it was something I kept, not because I understood its importance, but because I never throw anything away without reading it first. When I placed it into an acid-free plastic sleeve in 1998, I knew it was something worth keeping, even if I didn't yet know why. Those items are not dusty stacks of paper. They are evidence that people, whoever they were, whenever they lived, felt that what they wrote mattered enough to send it into the world. Preserving that evidence is a way of honoring the moment when someone once held a pen and chose to write. After authenticating the Lincoln letter and before the meeting with the Smithsonian, I met James Okafor again at the Philadelphia History Museum to prepare. "Adele, I want to tell you something before your meeting with the Smithsonian," he said as we sat in his small office. "They're going to offer to buy the Lincoln letter separately. That's the standard approach. They'll want the most important item and leave the rest of the decision to you." "I don't want to sell it separately," I said. "I know. I just want you prepared when they ask." He looked at me. "Why don't you want to sell it separately, if I may ask?" I thought about the question for a moment. Because that letter has been in my collection for 25 years, not for any special reason, but because I kept it there. It's been preserved alongside everything else in the collection under the same standards. To separate it and sell it individually would mean treating it as something different from the rest. But that letter didn't just happen to be well preserved. It's in that condition because it's part of a collection that's been cared for as a whole. James Okafor sat quietly for about 10 seconds. "That's one of the most mature answers about preservation I've heard in years," he said finally. "I'll pass that along to Dr. Webb." "No need," I said. "I'll say it directly to her at the meeting." The first winter I lived at Rittenhouse Square was the winter I read more than I had in years. Not because I suddenly had more time. In fact, my schedule was quite busy with my role on the advisory board for the Smithsonian's Private Collections Program, with several online consultations for young collectors, and with a small memoir project Dr. Webb had suggested I consider. Rather, it was because for the first time in years, I read because I wanted to read, not because I had to follow any schedule or priority. Mornings with tea and books, afternoons with tea and books. On snowy days in Philadelphia, less frequent than in New York, but enough to make Rittenhouse Square beautiful, I would sit by the window and read while watching the snow fall over the square. And the book I was reading in October, A History of 19th Century Presidential Correspondence that Dr. Webb had given me, led me to other books, and those books led to more, following the nonlinear chain of thought that real readers often experience. I read about Abraham Lincoln, not for the first time. I had read extensively about him over the years of archival work, but reading about him after having seen his handwriting on that letter, after having held the paper he once held, placing my fingers near the very spots where his pen had touched, was a different experience. That's something people outside archival work don't understand. We don't just work with documents. We work with the connection between past and present, and sometimes that connection becomes so tangible that it compresses the distance of time in a strange way. Now, what Diane couldn't understand, and perhaps never would until she had her own equivalent experience, is that those dusty stacks of paper are not stacks at all. They are small windows into time. Places where the distance between the living and the dead becomes shorter if you know how to look through them. This story begins with loss and ends with recovery, but what is recovered is not exactly what was lost. The collection I retrieved from Antique Attic was the same papers, stamps, and letters that Diane had taken out, but it wasn't the same as before it had been taken. not because it was physically damaged or altered, but because I had changed in the 2 days from Saturday to Tuesday. The collection was no longer something I simply kept in a safe and looked at occasionally. It was something I had to act to protect, and that action changed my relationship with it. Later, when it went to the Smithsonian, what I lost was not the physical objects themselves, but their physical proximity to me. What I regained, however, was something else, and in some ways, I'm something greater. The recognition that 37 years of building and preserving were not useless nostalgia or the confusion of old age, but meaningful work. I think about it in a way I haven't said directly in this story. The collection was how I continued doing archival work even after leaving the Free Library. When I selected and preserved each document over 37 years, I was doing what archivists do, deciding that something is worth keeping and worth caring for properly. The only difference between my work at the Free Library and my personal collection is this. At the library, decisions about what to keep were made by a committee based on institutional criteria. In my personal collection, the decisions were mine, guided by knowledge and instincts accumulated over many years. And in the case of the Lincoln letter, that instinct, though not yet fully explained, was correct. The value of time is not measured in dollars. It is found in the small decisions you make over the years about what is worth keeping, what is worth noticing, and what is worth protecting. And sometimes, not often, not for everyone, those small decisions add up to something greater than any amount of money can measure.